They say the river has no memory, that its waters wash away every footprint, every sin, every secret carried into its depths. But those who live in the valley know otherwise. They whisper that the river remembers everything, that beneath its surface it holds the bones of the forgotten and the voices of the drowned, and they tell of a night when a young bride gave herself to the current, not out of despair, but out of love. A love that was older than the village, older than the stones, older than the earth itself. Her name was Elara. Her story begins not in the moment of her drowning, but in the nights leading to it, when the river first began to call her name. Elara was 17 when she first heard the voice. She had been walking alone along the water's edge at dusk, her bare feet sinking into the mud when the current shifted in a way that made no sense. The waves curled against the bank, not with the random pull of tide, but with a rhythm, as though responding to her breath. She leaned closer, and in the soft roar of water against stone, she swore she heard a whisper. Not words, not language, but something deeper, something that pressed against her chest and filled her lungs with a sweetness she had never known. From that night, she returned to the river again and again, drawn as though her blood itself belonged to it. Her family noticed the change. She ate little, slept less, her eyes always searching for the shimmer of water in the distance. They thought it was grief, for her betrothed had died that spring in a hunting accident, leaving her unmarried in a place where women without husbands were seen as burdens. But grief fades. What consumed Elara was different. Her cheeks grew hollow, yet her skin glowed as if lit from within. Some said she was ill, others said she had been touched by something divine. Only Elara knew the truth. She was in love. Not with a man of flesh and blood, but with the river that ran past their village like a dark vein. At first, the voice came only at dusk. Then it followed her into dreams. She would wake with her bed soaked, not from sweat, but from water beading her skin as though she had been submerged. Her hair smelled of moss, her lips tasted of salt, and when she looked into her mirror, sometimes the reflection was not her own. Sometimes it was the face of a man, pale, ageless, with eyes like deep water and a mouth that never moved yet spoke volumes. He promised her union, a bond that no blade could sever, no death could undo. He told her she was chosen, that her body had been prepared across generations to become his bride. She did not question, she only listened. On the eve of midsummer, Elara vanished from her family's house. Her bed was empty, her gown folded neatly at its foot, but the door was left open, and the air smelled of rain though the sky was clear. Villagers followed the path to the riverbank, where they found a trail of bare footprints, pressed deep into the earth, leading straight into the water. They did not end at the edge. They continued into the shallows until the current erased them. And there, at the mouth of the river, her veil drifted, caught on a root, soaked through as though waiting for the head it once adorned. No body was ever found. The elders told the villagers not to speak of it, to say that Elara had drowned herself in madness, that her spirit was lost. But the children of the valley knew better. They said they saw her at night, walking just beneath the surface of the river, her hair spreading like seaweed, her eyes glowing with the same pale light that shimmered across the waves in moonlight. Some claimed to hear laughter when no one else did, soft and beckoning. Others swore they had seen her hand pressing against the glassy surface, as if reaching from the other side. Those who followed the sound of her voice too closely often did not return. Weeks passed, then months, but the river would not forget. It began to rise without warning. Fishermen spoke of nets that returned torn, not by rocks or creatures, but as though cut by sharp, unseen hands. Women washing clothes at the bank reported feeling fingers brushing their ankles. Livestock refused to drink from it, pulling away with panicked cries. And at night, the water gleamed with an unnatural silver, forming shapes that looked less like waves and more like faces. Faces of children not yet born, of ancestors long buried, of something ancient and watching. It was in the depth of winter, when snow lay thick and the river should have been frozen solid, that the villagers realized what had happened. The water never froze. It ran strong, dark, and warm as blood. And in the stillness of those nights, voices carried across the valley. Some were whispers, some were wails. But threaded among them, always, was the voice of Elara, calling, pleading, promising. She was not gone. She had not drowned. She had been taken, married, bound. The elders gathered in secret, their lanterns dimmed, their mouths bitter with silence. They confessed what they had long hidden, that this was not the first time. Generations ago, another bride had vanished in the same way, and another before her. Each century, the river demanded one. A bride born of the valley's bloodline, chosen before her birth, prepared by forces no one dared name. And Elara, though she did not know it, had been fated from the moment she drew her first breath. The villagers were warned never to interfere, never to resist. The river had taken her, and in time, it would take another. But then the children began to vanish. One by one, boys and girls disappeared from their beds, their blankets left damp, their footprints leading always to the water's edge. And in their place, something was left behind. Driftwood carved into the shape of small bodies, hollowed and split, as though mocking the flesh that once occupied them. Mothers wept, fathers sharpened axes, but none dared cross into the current. None except one. For on the seventh night, Elara's own sister, barely 12 years old, awoke screaming that she had seen Elara's face at her window, smiling, beckoning, her teeth sharp as glass. And when she spoke, her words were not her own. They were the river's. The villagers bolted their doors, but it was too late. For the river was rising, higher than it ever had before, spilling into fields, swallowing fences, licking at the very steps of their homes. It was no longer waiting for them to come. It was coming for them. And on that night, when the church bells rang though no hand touched the rope, the villagers gathered on the hill and saw her. Elara in her wedding gown, drifting above the water, as though the river itself held her aloft, her eyes burning with silver light. She raised her hand, and behind her, shapes began to emerge from the current. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, brides in tattered veils, children with hollow eyes, men with mouths sewn shut. The river had not simply taken her, it had given her a kingdom. What she whispered to them that night, no one agreed upon. Some said it was a promise. Others said it was a curse. But when the dawn broke, half the village was gone, carried away by the flood, and the survivors swore they would never speak her name again. But the river remembers, and so does Elara. And when the thaw comes in spring, something will return from those waters. Something that should never walk on land. The thaw came early that year, breaking the ice before the villagers could prepare. The river swelled with a force that made the earth itself tremble, and in its restless foam, the people swore they saw pale hands reaching, clawing, searching for ground. They barred their doors, prayed to saints who had long abandoned them. And still the waters rose. But what the river gave back that spring was not just flood. It was Elara. She stepped from the current as if she had never drowned at all, her gown trailing behind her in sodden tatters, her skin pale but unbroken, her eyes lit from within like lanterns buried under ice. The villagers fell to their knees, some in fear, some in awe, for she did not walk alone. Behind her came the children who had vanished, each one altered. Their limbs were too long, their skin too translucent, their eyes too dark. They clung to her skirts like shadows that had learned to breathe. When the mothers reached for them, the children did not recognize their names. They did not speak. They only stared, silent and unblinking, until the river tugged them back, and they dissolved into its foam. Elara remained. She did not collapse, nor ask for shelter. She stood in the village square, dripping, her hair tangled with reeds, her fingers webbed with thin strands of silver. She looked at her sister, the child who had seen her at the window, and whispered one word, "Come." Her voice was not her own. It carried the weight of the riverbed, the groaning of stone, the endless patience of water grinding rock to sand. The villagers tried to drag the girl away, but Elara's gaze fixed her in place. The child's body swayed like a reed in the wind, and before any hand could restrain her, she walked barefoot into her sister's arms. What happened next was witnessed by all and understood by none. Elara bent her head to her sister's ear, and as she whispered, the girl's face began to change. Her skin rippled like water disturbed by a stone. Her hair darkened, her eyes widened, her bones reshaped beneath her flesh as though being written anew. When she looked up again, she was no longer the girl they had known. She was something older, something that should have remained in the depths. And when she smiled, her teeth glimmered like shards of glass caught in moonlight. That night, the church bells tolled again without touch, and every house in the village trembled with the weight of what they had seen. The elders gathered, voices hushed, and one of them finally confessed. Long before their time, long before memory, the people of the valley had struck a bargain. Each generation, one bride would be given to the river. In return, the waters would grant life to their crops, fish to their nets, protection from storms and drought. But the covenant had been broken when a bride, long ago, resisted. She had fled the water's call, and from that defiance had grown the curse that now bore Elara's name. The villagers asked what must be done, but the elder only shook his head. "The river never forgets," he said. "It only collects. Each gift denied becomes a debt, and every debt is paid with blood." And now, the river was no longer content with brides. It wanted lineage. It wanted children. It wanted a kingdom. That night, the villagers locked their doors and barred their windows. But doors mean nothing to water. Windows mean nothing to whispers. The sound came first, the trickle of streams where none should be, seeping through cracks in the wood, spreading across floors like veins. Then came the smell, damp earth and moss, the scent of graves long drowned. And then came Elara, not through door or window, but through the very walls, her body carried by water that moved as though it obeyed her will alone. She stood in the center of each home she entered, her gown dripping, her eyes unblinking, and asked the same question, "Will you come?" Some refused, clutching their children, weeping prayers. To them, the water rose until it filled their lungs, and their cries were silenced in gurgling collapse. Some obeyed, stepping forward as if under spell, taking her hand. Those she led into the night, down to the riverbank, where the water opened like a mouth and swallowed them whole. None who entered returned. By dawn, half the village was gone, and those who remained swore they had seen faces in the water. Familiar, beloved, twisted beyond recognition yet still theirs. And in the center of the river stood Elara, no longer clothed in tatters, but in a gown spun of flowing water, a crown of reeds upon her head, her sister at her side. The bride had become a queen, and the river, once a boundary, had become her throne. But there was something else, something worse, for the river's voice was no longer only hers. It had multiplied. Dozens of whispers, hundreds of sighs, rose from the water's surface. The river was no longer satisfied with one bride. It was demanding more, and its gaze stretched beyond the valley, toward villages and towns that had never feared its current. The elders gathered again, their faces pale, their voices breaking. "The flood," one said. "It is not a flood. It is a wedding procession. She will not stop until every child, every bride, every soul belongs to the water." And as the words left his mouth, a tremor passed through the ground, and the bells tolled once more, 3 times, slow and hollow, as if wrung from beneath the earth. And on the riverbank, Elara lifted her gaze to the mountains. The snow was melting faster than it ever had before, torrents rushing down toward the valley. The river was growing, swelling, hungering. It would not be contained. It would not be denied. And in that moment, One question filled every heart in the village, a question none dared speak aloud. But all could feel pressing against their ribs. When the river comes for you, will you resist, or will you answer the call? The river did not wait for an answer. By the third night, its waters had spread far beyond the valley, swallowing the fields that once fed the village. Creeping into the forests where children used to play, the hunters who ventured too near spoke of paths that ended abruptly at walls of water, shimmering like glass, their own reflections staring back with faces they did not recognize. One returned without eyes. Another returned without a tongue. Most did not return at all. Elara no longer appeared only on the riverbank. She was seen walking through the mist that rolled across the hills, her gown glistening with dew that never dried, her fingers trailing along doors and windows as if marking those within. Wherever she touched, wood swelled, stone cracked, and from the fractures seeped thin streams of water that carried with them faint whispers. Some swore the whispers spoke their names. Others swore the whispers wept like lost children. None dared listen too long. Her sister, the girl transformed, had grown in ways that defied nature. Only a season had passed, yet she stood taller than women twice her age, her hair lengthening each night as though pulled downward by invisible hands. When she opened her mouth, her voice carried not one tone but many, a chorus echoing with the sound of waves striking stone. She followed Elara silently, never far from her side, and when the villagers tried to look at her face, they swore her features shifted. Sometimes she bore the eyes of their lost children, sometimes the mouths of their dead husbands, sometimes nothing human at all. The villagers clung to the church for safety, its bells tolling on their own, its candles flickering without flame. But faith cannot drown out water. One by one, the pews warped and split as streams ran between the stones, carrying with them fragments of bone, bits of cloth, rusted rings that belonged to those already taken. The priest stood before his flock, trembling, holding high the crucifix. But when the doors burst open and the flood poured in, he did not raise his voice. He dropped the cross, dropped to his knees, and whispered a single plea to the water, "Take me." The flood obeyed. That night, the church itself was swallowed, its steeple jutting from the current like a broken tooth. And on its highest point, silhouetted against the storm, Elara stood, her veil whipping in the wind. The people who saw her swore her gown no longer clung to her body like cloth, but flowed outward in streams that merged with the river itself, as though she were no longer bride nor queen, but the river incarnate. And when she raised her hands, the waters rose in answer, carrying with them the faces of the drowned. They lined the surface like lilies, eyes open, mouths gasping soundlessly, staring at the village that still dared resist. It was then the elders revealed their final truth. The covenant had not been made with the river itself, but with something older that slept within it. A spirit, a groom, a god whose name had been erased from every book, every record, but not from memory. They called it the drowned king. Elara had not married the river. She had married him, and through her he was waking. The villagers, desperate, chose one among them to flee, to carry word beyond the valley before all was lost. A young man, strong and swift, was given no weapon, only a torch to guide his way. He ran through the night, the path behind him flooding with each step, the water chasing him like a beast on the hunt. He did not look back. He did not dare. By dawn, he reached the ridge that overlooked the valley, and when he turned, what he saw froze his breath. The valley was gone. In its place lay a vast lake, dark and glistening, stretching farther than his eyes could see. The village, the fields, the forests, all had vanished beneath the water. Only the church steeple remained, and upon it Elara, her gaze fixed upon him even from that distance. He swore her lips moved, forming words he could not hear. But he felt them in his bones, a whisper that did not fade when he fled, a whisper that would follow him until his dying day. "You are mine too." The young man stumbled into the next village, ragged, bleeding, eyes wild with terror. He spoke of floods and brides, of children reborn in water, of a queen who had risen from the depths. The villagers laughed at first, dismissed him as a madman, but when he coughed, water spilled from his mouth. When he opened his hand, fish scales clung to his skin. And when he tried to sleep, his body writhed as though currents passed beneath his flesh. By morning he was gone, his bed soaked, his window wide open, the floor leading to the river damp with footprints not his own. And so the curse spread. Not bound to one valley, not contained by mountains, but flowing outward, village by village, carried on streams and whispers, in the lungs of those who fled, and the dreams of those who listened. Alara's wedding was no longer a tragedy of one village. It was becoming an inheritance of nations. And still the bells rang, tolling from steeples that had long since crumbled, echoing across the waters like promises made in the dark. Each note said the same thing. Each note carried the same warning. The bride was coming. The groom was waiting. And the world was running out of places to hide. They said the river would never cross the mountains. That its hunger was bound to the valley, its vengeance limited by stone and earth. But they were wrong. By the time the third winter ended, the rivers of three kingdoms had begun to behave strangely, currents reversed against the pull of gravity. Bridges collapsed without warning. Wells swelled and burst with water that glowed faintly in the dark, and in towns hundreds of miles from Alara's village, fishermen pulled up nets filled not with fish but with wedding veils. Pale, sodden, and still warm to the touch. In the capital city of Rethane, far from any riverbank, a scholar named Dr. Ansel Corvin spent sleepless nights studying water samples that defied chemical explanation. What he found terrified him. Every sample contained traces of something alive. Not bacteria, not algae, but cells structured like human tissue, except older, far older than any living organism. He called them bride cells, though he never published the name. His colleagues laughed when he suggested the water was learning, that it remembered the people it touched. But laughter turned to silence when the water began to move in the laboratory flasks. Not swirling, not boiling, but breathing. The first city to fall was Redwick. It began with rain that refused to stop, days stretching into weeks until the streets became canals. People took boats to market, waded through water to reach their beds. But this water was not rain. It smelled faintly of lilies and old blood. It clung to skin like breath. And at night, those who listened closely could hear songs beneath its surface. Lullabies in a language no one alive could speak. When the water reached the cathedral steps, the bells began to ring on their own. And in the reflection of the rising flood, people saw a face, pale, veiled, watching. By spring, Redwick was gone. Not drowned, not destroyed, simply gone, erased as if it had never existed. Where its streets once lay, a lake shimmered, its depths impossibly dark. Ships that tried to cross vanished before reaching the far side. Birds refused to fly over it. And yet, at its center, witnesses swore they saw a woman walking on the surface, her gown trailing behind her like a bridal train miles long. Rumors spread faster than the water. Some called her the drowned bride, others the river queen. But those who had seen her and survived whispered a different name. Mother. It was not reverence in their voices but instinct, as if the word was carved into their blood before birth. Entire villages abandoned their homes to flee inland, but the rivers followed them, carving new paths through mountains, swallowing roads, rising through cracks in the earth where no river had ever flowed. One night, Dr. Corvin dreamed he was standing on the shores of a sea he had never seen. The sky was black, the horizon endless, and across the water stretched an unbroken procession of brides. Thousands, tens of thousands, walking hand in hand into the depths. At their head was Alara, her eyes two pools of unreflecting darkness. When she reached him, she did not speak. She pressed a hand against his chest, and when he awoke, his bedsheets were soaked with river water, and his heart beat to a rhythm that was not his own. The world's rulers tried everything: dams, barriers, controlled burns. But nothing could stop the advancing tide. Scientists proposed draining the rivers into the sea, but the seas themselves had begun to swell, rising higher each year without storm or reason. The oldest sailors spoke of shapes beneath the waves, structures too symmetrical to be choral, too deliberate to be nature. Temples, they said, altars, thrones, and then the dreams began. Millions around the world shared the same vision: a wedding beneath the waters, a crown of bone placed on a bride's head, and a voice that echoed like a tide against the shore. Soon, some awoke screaming, some never awoke at all. And those who vanished in their sleep were later found drifting downstream, their bodies unmarked, their lips curled into smiles. By the end of that year, one fact had become undeniable. Elara was no longer a ghost story. She was no longer a legend confined to a forgotten valley. She was everywhere, in the rain, in the rivers, in the tears of those who dreamt of her. Humanity had not witnessed the rise of a curse. It had witnessed the birth of a new dominion, and like all empires, it began with a marriage, a bride, a groom, and a vow carved not in words, but in water. On the eve of the first global flood, when cities prepared for the final evacuation, and prayers echoed from every faith, a traveler returned to the ruined valley where it all began. He carried no weapon, only a small, rusted locket engraved with a single name: Elara. And as he knelt beside the silent shore, the water rose to meet his hands, curling around his fingers like a lover's touch. It whispered something he had not heard in decades, a phrase that would change everything once more: the wedding is not over. The traveler who knelt at the valley's edge did not rise when the water touched him. He closed his eyes and let the whisper fill him. And for the first time since the flood began, the river's voice did not sound like hunger, it sounded like longing. The locket slipped from his fingers into the current, and the water folded over it gently, as if tucking a child into bed. When he opened his eyes again, the valley was no longer empty. Where there had been only black water and silence, shapes now stood along the shore, figures pale and familiar, wearing wedding garlands that had long since rotted, their eyes fixed on him. They were brides, not just Elara, not just those who had vanished from the village, but thousands, gathered as if for a ceremony eternal. They did not speak. They waited, and then she came. Elara rose from the depths, her gown flowing into the river itself, her veil unfurling across the surface like a second sky. She did not look like the bride the village once knew. She looked like a sovereign, crowned in bone and pearl, her hands heavy with rings not of gold but of coral, her gaze carrying the weight of oceans. Yet when she saw the traveler, something in her expression faltered. Her lips parted, and the voice of 1,000 tides murmured a single word: his name. The world beyond the valley did not pause for this reunion. Seas breached their borders, turning coasts into graveyards. Entire continents shrank as waters advanced inland. Ships sent to rescue survivors returned empty, their decks washed clean as though no crew had ever stood upon them. And yet, in the midst of this global drowning, stories began to spread of sanctuaries, places untouched by flood, hidden enclaves where the waters stopped short, as if forbidden to pass. No one agreed on their locations. Some claimed they lay in deserts, others in mountains, others still in places no map acknowledged. But all the stories shared one detail: each sanctuary was marked by bells that tolled without hands, bells that rang as warnings and as invitations. Governments collapsed. Faiths intertwined, desperate to interpret the calamity. Some declared Elara the new Eve, mother of a world reborn through water. Others swore she was the herald of apocalypse, the bride of death himself. And everywhere, people dreamed of her, not only of her, but of the groom. His form was never seen, only felt: a shadow deeper than any trench, a silence heavier than stone, a presence that made blood run cold even in dreams. When he whispered, the earth shook. When he stirred, waves rose higher than cities. Back in the valley, the traveler reached out his hand, not to beg, not to defy, but to offer. Elara took it. For a moment, her gown stilled, the water stopped moving, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The brides along the shore lowered their heads as though in reverence. And from the depths, something answered. A rumble rolled upward, deeper than thunder, older than language. The river parted, revealing steps descending into darkness, a wedding hall carved not by man but by eternity itself. The traveler looked into Elara's eyes and understood the truth that had eluded every elder, every scholar, every ruler. The wedding was not the end. It was the beginning. The waters had not come to destroy the world. They had come to remake it, to draw every soul into a covenant older than memory. A covenant that demanded not fear, not resistance, but vows. And as he followed Elara down those impossible steps, into the depths where the groom waited, the bells rang again. Not 3 times, not 12, but endlessly, a chorus of iron voices across land and sea, announcing to every living ear that the ceremony had entered its next stage. And far above, in cities sinking beneath their own reflections, people woke from dreams of veils and crowns, with water in their lungs and words on their tongues. They did not understand. I do. The descent was endless. Each step the traveler took with Elara seemed to pull him not just deeper into the river, but further away from the world itself. The water did not choke him. It opened like air, surrounding him with currents that glowed faintly blue, revealing corridors carved of stone, so ancient they seemed older than earth. Along the walls, he saw faces pressed into the rock. Faces of brides, of children, of the drowned. Their eyes followed him, unblinking, their lips moving silently, as if repeating vows too sacred for the living to hear. Elara walked ahead, her veil spreading outward, brushing against the walls. Wherever it touched, the stone softened into rippling water. She was no longer a bride led to her fate. She was leading him, as if to introduce him to something she had always known would come. Her sister appeared beside her now, grown taller still, her features shifting between beauty and terror, always reflecting the viewer's deepest memory of love. She carried no candle, yet her eyes lit the way. The corridor widened until it became a hall vast enough to hold cities. Pillars of coral stretched upward into darkness, draped with veils that fluttered though there was no wind. At the center of the hall was a dais carved from obsidian, blacker than night, its surface slick with water that never dripped. And above it, suspended as if the sea itself bent to hold him, was the groom. No form could describe him fully. He was absence and presence, shadow and substance, a figure both human and not, crowned with a halo of bone that never stopped growing. His face was veiled in white so bright it burned the eyes, yet beneath it pulsed a darkness deeper than the void between stars. His hands, long and pale, rested on the dais, and when he moved them, the water across the world shifted. The traveler dropped to his knees. Not because he chose to, but because every bone in his body bowed. The groom did not speak in words. His voice came as a tide inside the skull, filling every hollow, washing through marrow, commanding silence. And in that silence, one truth became clear. This was not a man, not a god, not a ghost. This was hunger given form. This was devotion without end. Elara knelt beside the groom, her hand sliding into his as if it had always belonged there. She turned to the traveler and raised her other hand. "Witness," she said, her voice no longer her own but his carried through her. "Witness and remember." The days trembled, the water above surged downward like a great curtain falling, and suddenly the hall was filled with brides. Endless brides, veiled and silent, standing in perfect rows. Each one turned their gaze to the traveler. Each one whispered in unison, "We do." And above, on the surface world, storms erupted across every sea at once. Tides swallowed coasts, rivers climbed mountains, rain fell in sheets so heavy it crushed roofs. The bells tolled from every steeple, even those long broken, and across every continent people fell to their knees, choking on water that poured from their mouths though they had not drunk. The groom rose from the dais. For the first time, he lifted his veil. The traveller's eyes burned with the sight, yet he could not look away. Behind the veil was no face, no flesh, only a void, vast and endless, filled with currents and stars drowned long ago. It was not a face to be loved, but it was a face to be obeyed. And when the void opened, when the groom leaned forward, the traveller felt his heart unmake itself in his chest. And still, the groom spoke only one word, carried on every wave, every raindrop, every river rushing through the veins of the world. More. The ceremony was not complete. The wedding was still gathering its guests. The word echoed through the water, through the bones of the earth, through the lungs of every living thing. More. It was not a request. It was not a demand. It was a law, a decree that bent the spine of the world until it cracked. The traveller clutched his chest, feeling his heart falter, not from fear but from obedience, as if the organ itself longed to answer the groom's command. The brides moved first. Each one lifted her veil, and beneath them were not faces but mirrors, polished with tears and river light, each one reflecting the viewer's own image but altered, twisted, drowned, eyes filled with silt. The traveller saw himself 1,000 times, each reflection rotting in a different way. One face was bloated, lips chewed by unseen mouths. Another was pale, hair drifting like seaweed. Another bore the marks of hands gripping its throat, yet still smiling in devotion. The mirrors turned, and with each turn, the traveller felt pieces of himself peel away, floating from his skin like scales. Elara's sister stepped onto the dais. She carried something in her arms now. A bundle swaddled in black silk. The silk writhed as though something inside it struggled to breathe. She held it toward the groom, and the groom did not move, yet the silk parted as though obeying his unseen hands. Inside lay not a child, but a fragment of the traveller himself, his own rib, torn fresh, still wet with marrow. His chest ached with its absence, and yet he had not seen it taken. Elara touched the bundle and whispered words older than rivers. The rib pulsed, lengthened, twisted, shaping itself into a figure, small, fragile, gasping like a newborn. Yet its cries were not human. They were the sound of waves breaking over gravestones, the hiss of floods swallowing cities. The groom lowered his head, and the newborn opened its mouth wider than its body should allow. Water poured out, endless, drowning the days, flooding the hall. The brides did not move to escape. They welcomed the flood, letting it rise, letting it cover their veils, until they became nothing but shadows suspended in the tide. The traveller was dragged under. His lungs burned, but when he opened his mouth, water did not kill him. Instead, it filled him with whispers. Thousands of them, voices of brides, grooms, children, drowned kings, forgotten gods. They pressed against his skull until his vision blurred and his thoughts blurred away, leaving only one refrain: there is no end to the wedding. There is no end to the river. Above, in the world of air, wells overflowed with black water, rivers reversed their flow. Oceans opened their mouths and swallowed ships whole. In villages, brides vanished from their beds, leaving only wet veils tangled in the sheets. In cities, church bells rang without hands to move them. Mothers wept salt water. Fathers awoke with algae in their throats. The wedding had stretched its veil across the whole earth. When the traveller opened his eyes again, he was no longer in the hall. He was in his own village, on the banks of the river, where the first vow had been spoken. The houses stood silent, their doors wide, their hearths cold. But every window was filled with faces, veiled, watching, waiting. And beside him stood Elara, her hand clasped with the groom's, though the groom was not bound to shape now. He was the river itself, coiling around them, reflecting no stars. Elara leaned close, her breath warm though her lips were blue. "You were chosen to see the beginning," she said, "but beginnings are only promises. The wedding does not end. It only widens. The river surged. The bells tolled, and as the traveller turned, he saw his own reflection ripple in the black water. But the reflection was not him. It was a bride veiled, waiting to be called. The veil drifted over his reflection, and when it lifted again, the traveller was no longer certain if he was looking into the water or out of it. The village around him breathed like a living thing. Walls sighing with damp, roofs dripping with unseen condensation. Each house leaned toward the river as if drawn by an invisible hand. From their chimneys rose not smoke but mist, thick and wet, carrying the faint scent of lilies and rot. Children's laughter rang in the air, yet there were no children to be seen. The sound came from the wells, from the gutters, from the dark mouths of the alleyways. And every laugh carried the same refrain, "We do." The traveller covered his ears, but the vow sank through his skin, curling in his veins like water seeping into wood. Alara walked beside him, no longer veiled, her face pale and luminous as the moon reflected in a storm tide. She looked upon the village with no sorrow, no joy, only recognition, as though she had returned to something promised to her before birth. The groom was not beside her now, yet his presence weighed upon the air, pressing the traveller's chest, until he struggled to breathe. The river itself had become the groom's body, spilling into the streets, winding through doorways, flooding thresholds. Every step the traveller took splashed, though the ground had not yet fully surrendered. A door opened. From within emerged a woman, veiled in black. She carried a bowl, and within the bowl sloshed water that was darker than ink. Without speaking, she poured it over her own head, drenching the veil, and then walked calmly back inside. Another door opened, then another. Soon the entire village moved as one, veiled figures carrying bowls of river water, baptizing themselves again and again. Each face beneath the veil was blurred, indistinct, as though the river had washed their identities away. The traveller tried to run, but his feet carried him toward the church at the village centre. Its steeple leaned as though bent by centuries of storms, and its bell tolled though no rope moved. Inside, the pews were full. Every villager sat silently, hands folded, veils dripping. At the altar stood Ilara's sister, her eyes glowing like lanterns lit beneath the sea. In her arms she held the newborn fashioned from the traveller's rib, now grown into something larger, something neither child nor adult but both at once. Its eyes were hollow pools. Its skin was translucent, veins filled not with blood but flowing streams. The groom's voice filled the church without a source. More. The word shook the rafters, cracked the stone floor, made the traveller's teeth ache. The newborn lifted its arms, and the walls of the church melted into water. The ceiling opened into a black sky with no stars. And where the altar once stood, the river poured upward instead of down, a column of water stretching into infinity. One by one, the veiled villagers rose and walked into the column. They did not scream. They did not stumble. They surrendered. Each veil dissolved as they entered. Each body became current, and the column widened. The church became nothing more than a whirlpool, and above it the bells tolled with a sound that was neither metal nor air, but bone striking bone. The traveller turned to flee, but Ilara's hand caught his wrist. Her touch was gentle, but it froze his blood to stillness. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, her voice was hers alone, untainted by the groom. "You cannot leave," she whispered. "You are part of the vow now. Your name is written in the water. Even if you run, the river will find you." The column roared louder, pulling the sky itself into its spiral. And as the traveller was dragged closer, his reflection appeared once more. Not in the water this time, but in the eyes of the newborn. It smiled with his mouth. It reached with his hands. And when it spoke, its voice was his auntie. "Wadu." The column swallowed him. Cold tore through his lungs, but it was not drowning. It was erasure. Every memory he clung to dissolved like chalk in rain. His mother's face, his first breath, the sound of his own name, all unthreaded, carried into the whirlpool. He tried to scream, but the river claimed even his voice, weaving it into the roar of the current. And then, silence. He opened his eyes and stood on a shore that did not exist in the world he had known. The sky above was pale, without sun or moon, only a dim glow that seemed to come from nowhere. The sand beneath his feet was made of bone dust, soft and brittle, crunching with each step. Before him stretched an ocean black as ink, and within its waves glimmered faces. Countless faces, rising and sinking, veiled and unveiled, all whispering the same vow that had bound his life. Wadu. Ilara stood upon the shore with him. Her veil fluttered though there was no wind. Behind her, rows of brides stretched into the horizon, infinite in number, each holding lilies that never wilted. They moved in unison, their steps synchronized with the pull of the tide. The traveler turned to speak to her, to beg for release. But when she met his eyes, he saw only reflection, his own face beneath her veil. The groom rose from the ocean, not as a man nor a shadow nor a void. This time, he was the sea itself. A wave higher than mountains surged forward, shaping itself into a form vast and formless, eyes like whirlpools, crown made of storm clouds. His voice was the tide crashing. The vow widens. The newborn appeared in the traveler's arms, though he had not lifted them. Its skin shimmered like glass filled with rivers. It clutched his wrist with fingers sharp as reeds and whispered in his own voice. Father, husband, brother. All the same, all the river. The words cut through his mind like hooks, pulling him deeper into obedience. He wanted to drop the child, to flee, but his body no longer belonged to him. His heart beat with the rhythm of waves. His veins pulsed with currents instead of blood. The brides encircled him, chanting softly, each voice blending into the sound of the tide. We do, we do, we do. The chant grew louder, shaking the sky. The groom leaned down, lowering his storm-crowned head until the traveler was forced to bow. And as the ocean swallowed the bone shore, as the tide claimed the last trace of solid ground, the groom spoke again. One more bride. The traveler felt the veil settle over his head. It was soaked heavy, pulling his spine into submission. He clawed at it, but his hands were no longer his. They smoothed the veil, tightened the knot, prepared himself for vows he had not agreed to. Ilara smiled faintly, stepping aside to make space for him among the infinite procession. Her sister placed lilies in his hand. The newborn clung to his chest. And when the bell tolled in the skyless world, the traveler realized the wedding had claimed him. Not as witness, not as guest, but as bride. The ocean roared. The veil drowned his sight. And somewhere in the deepest current, the groom whispered, "Forever." The word forever echoed, until it no longer sounded like language, but like the pulse of the world itself. The traveler stumbled beneath the soaked veil, his knees buckling against the bone dust now dissolving into tide. The newborn clutched tighter, veins glowing brighter, its glassy skin throbbing with rivers that pulsed like veins of light. Every beat of its heart seemed to bind him more tightly to the groom, more tightly to the vow. The ocean rose until there was no shore, no horizon, only water above, below, around. Yet he did not drown. He floated, suspended, as if the groom's body had become both cage and cradle. Brides drifted in the currents beside him, their veils stretching like jellyfish tendrils, eyes wide and glowing. They turned to him as one, whispering the vow with lips that barely moved. Ilara swam through them, her veil trailing behind like a comet's tail. She reached him with ease, as though the water bent itself to her will. "You understand now," she murmured, her voice carrying perfectly clear in the flood. "There is no ending, no escape, only continuation. Each vow is a river that feeds the next. You are water as I am water. We are the groom's eternal tide." He shook his head, but the movement was sluggish, as though the groom's currents weighed down his denial. "I never said yes," he whispered, though the water carried the words into silence. "You didn't have to," Ilara replied, Her hand pressed to his chest, and beneath his ribs he felt not a heartbeat, but the swirl of eddies. The vow was in you before you were born. Your refusal is only another form of surrender. The groom's voice thundered, not above or below, but within his marrow, more. The newborn in his arms lifted its head, and for the first time its hollow eyes blinked. Inside them, he saw not reflection but memory, his own life flashing like rivers of film. Every moment he thought was his stolen, rewritten, claimed. He saw his first breath, not in his mother's arms, but in the groom's flood. He saw his first words spoken not to his family, but to the river's current. His entire life was revealed to be nothing but preparation for this vow. The newborn smiled with his smile. It opened its mouth, and his own voice came out. Wadu. The brides repeated it in unison. The ocean surged in agreement. The veil tightened over his head, fusing to his skin until there was no separating fabric from flesh. His body elongated, bending with the water, bones softening, reshaping. He felt his face blur, his edges dissolve, until he too was current, he too was tied. The groom welcomed him not with embrace, but with absorption, folding him into infinity. Ella drifted closer, touching her veil to his. Their voices merged into one vow that rose like a storm through the infinite sea. The groom crowned them both in waves, the newborn clapping its translucent hands, laughter bubbling like spring water breaking rock. And still, from deeper below, more voices rose. More brides, more vows, more rivers feeding into the endless body of the groom. Each one another beginning, another episode, another chapter with no end. The traveler tried to ask, when does it stop? But no words came. Only the tide answered, carrying him forward, deeper, unending. The ocean whispered with infinite mouths, never.